Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I currently serve on the board of the Interreligious Council of Lynn County and am the Vice President of the Humanists of Lynn County. As most everyone in the world knows by now, 2 weeks ago, America suffered the worst mass shooting in its history. We'll be discussing the Las Vegas Massacre and how we as individuals, a community, and a nation can and should respond. I have with me this morning 3 guests that will help us navigate this very difficult and complex and sensitive subject. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
If I could, before we get into this, just have you take a few seconds to introduce yourself, your name, and a little bit of what you do.
Sure. I'm James Lynch. I'm a political reporter for the Gazette newspaper covering state government and politics.
I'm Bob Rush, and I'm a lawyer. I represent primarily injured workers.
Excellent.
And I'm Charlie Fields. I am a lieutenant with the Cedar Rapids Police Department. Been there for 23 years.
Very difficult subject here, and obviously a lot of people are have been very moved by this. In fact, I work with a lady who was directly involved with it, and she talked about how her life was her perspective on life has changed drastically. So it's impacted all of us in some way or the other. The title of this show is How Do We Respond? So I'm just going to throw that out there, and whoever wants to respond, do that. But is there a response to this? One response, or if there is, what is it?
Well, Ellen, I would say there's not one response because I think it depends. Your coworker, her response is obviously going to be different than someone who was, half a country away and watching this on the news and reading about it, not directly involved. And I think, each of us has to sort of respond in our own way. I think as a community, as a nation, probably the response maybe becomes more cohesive, but I think individuals respond in their own way. If you have a family member who was out there, someone you know personally, obviously it's going to be different than like I said, if you're just an observer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts there on that?
I would say it's a message to put slogans away. It's a time, really, that we ought to be able to move forward with serious conversation with all people on the issues, whether it's gun control, whether it's security, whether it's balancing freedom against security, mental health, and what are we going to do about it. I think it's an avenue to talk about all of these things on a serious level.
And that's what we hope to do for sure in the next few minutes. Lieutenant Fields?
And I have to agree with both these gentlemen here. It's time to put our politics and things aside and really have some deep discussion on how do we help fix these problems? Where's it coming from? Is it systemic? How do we address, and we're all, like you guys said, everybody's going to feel differently on this. I as a law enforcement officer become angered when I see things like this happen, and then I go to a place where how would I respond if I was there? What can I do to help that situation if it was to happen here in Cedar Rapids when I'm at work or even when I'm off duty, things like that. And we all need to think about those types of things too. Unfortunately, we're seeing more of this occur, so what do we do as individuals when we're in that situation? Did I prepare myself for that, and how would I respond if I was sitting there today when that happened?
Mm-hmm. We were talking earlier, I have 4 children, and all of them have smartphones, and all of them have access to this pictures, all Instagram, Snapchat, they're seeing pictures of this tragedy. We just have, in this generation, unprecedented access to this. 2 questions. Because of that, is there a danger of becoming very desensitized to tragedies like this because of overexposure? Number 2, how do we talk to our children about this?
Well,
Anybody?
I'll kind of jump off on that one. And you kind of hit the nail on the head when we talk about social media, Twitter, Facebook, just internet in general. There's a lot of information out there for these young people to look at, plus the video games that they play, the movies they watch, and the interactions they have with other kids. We need to just be upfront and frank with our kids. We should know our kids better than anybody else, and we should know how we should be able to talk to them and how they would deal with that. And that's part of just being a good parent and understanding what your children have, understand and what they don't understand, and not just sweep it under the rug and act like it didn't happen, because it did, and they're going to have questions, and they're going to want to know how they should respond. And it's okay to feel angry or scared, because these things are scary.
Yeah, absolutely, and they certainly are. Bob or James?
Well, I would agree with Charlie here. I think it's a first line of defense is in the home with the parent, in my case, a grandparent. How do you give guidance to kids going through and witnessing the carnage? Right. I think that's the challenge.
And I would say I think there is a danger of becoming desensitized, because we all deal with this in different ways. The initial response can be very emotional. Charlie talked about his response as a law enforcement officer, and I think in my work I sort of think about political solutions to situations. But over time, everybody's busy. Everybody has to go back to work, and so we go back to the regular humdrum of life. And I think the one thing that I found discouraging sort of in the initial response is how quickly a lot of people started using those slogans, just got into their camps and defending one thing or another, or attacking one person or another. And that's unfortunate, that we retreat into that sort of tribalism so quickly.
And we'll get into a little of that. So along this same line, with this particular massacre, this event that happened, whether you call it a massacre or tragedy, whatever, do you think the conversation has changed as compared to other? Do you think we're maybe finding some common ground here because of this? Has it reached such a point that a tipping point, if you will? What do you think what's your thoughts?
I think
on that?
every time we have an incident like this, it re-spurs that same conversation, and then after a while, it seems to go away and it wanes, and then we forget about it. And then all of a sudden we have we can go back to Sandy Hook. There was a large outcry after Sandy Hook occurred, and we had all those same feelings and things that spurred up in our country. And we thought that was a pivotal point in how we deal with these, and then we're right back to where we were at Sandy Hook. So I think sometimes we get too busy with our own lives, and we forget to think about those things and talk about them, and how do we make our lives better, and how do we treat each other? That's the other thing with the whole.
One of the things that I think has changed in this conversation is you hear people talking about some gun control legislation. People on the right, on the left, Democrats and Republicans, especially with the bump stock issue, where you can basically, I'm sure gun enthusiasts will correct me, but basically convert a semi-automatic weapon to an automatic weapon. And I think that has changed the conversation somewhat. I mean, you're hearing red state members of Congress, sportsmen, even the NRA is willing to think about some restriction on those, that sort of gear.
And we'll get into the kind of the elephant in the room, and that is, the role that guns played in this particular incident and what we do about it. But before we do that, I'd like to get your thought on, again, putting guns aside for a moment. What do you think is the key to decreasing these mass shooting incidences? Is there a key, or do you think there's some things we really need to focus on?
Well, I would say mental health, top of my list. People in their right mind don't commit the atrocities that this shooter did. We've got to make access to affordable, quality mental health care a priority. For too many decades, mental health has just been a stigma. You don't talk about people with mental health. If you've got mental, emotional difficulties, it's not the sort of thing you bring up and talk about. We've got to get it on the table. We've got to encourage people to seek out medical care. And frankly, in this state, as well as most states, there is not access to quality, affordable doctors in the specialty area.
And what I think is frustrating with this incident, I mean, this man really showed no signs of mental illness. He was prescribed a Valium, which he was taking, which has some side effects, but that's inconclusive, right? So, I mean, this is a really frustrating case, even in the case of mental health. Is there any other thoughts?
I would say that's one of the things that's changed the conversation in this case, is that in Sandy Hook and in so many of these shootings, you quickly discover that the person has mental health issues. And so it's maybe easier for some people to pigeonhole them and say, well, there you go. In this case, it's not obvious, at least not yet, that Stephen Paddock had any mental health issues that we could say caused him to do this. So I think that has changed the conversation somewhat. That, if you listen to the accounts his family has given, he was a regular guy and didn't have those problems.
The sad reality may be that in a free society, no matter how secure we may be, how strong our law enforcement is, how high our precautions are, random killing cannot be eliminated. We don't see this taking place in totalitarian societies because there's a lot of reasons, but in part, anybody who is a dissenter in whatever way, social or political, is marched off and imprisoned.
Yeah, Bill Riley made the point, that this may be the price of freedom. So, that's an interesting thought. I don't know how many people necessarily agree that has to be the case. Lieutenant Fields, do you have thoughts?
So there's, and I agree with the mental health piece of that, but there's also another piece that we could all be responsible for in this, and that's when you see something, say something. He didn't acquire all this stuff overnight, and he just didn't do it. So when you see something that doesn't feel right or doesn't look right, we need to report those type of things. And sometimes when we do that, maybe we can get that person the help they need before they get to the point where they've done that, whether it's the mental health thing or we stop the tragedy before it happens by taking the weapons away. We sit there and we talked about the guns a lot, but there was more involved in this than just the guns when you start looking at his plan in its totality with explosives and things like that. So, and he had to acquire those things over a period of time. So gun shop owners, people that work in the firearms industry, gas stations, places where you buy explosives, they need to be looking at who's purchasing what and when, and saying something when they have somebody that comes in there and buys things on multiple occasions. That should raise a red flag, and we should be able to, as a society, to say, hey, this doesn't feel right, and not be afraid to say something.
Right.
And I think that's a problem, right?
Right,
Yeah.
so we have to be vigilant, not paranoid necessarily, right? We still have to go about our lives. We can't, just lock ourselves in the house, but we have to be vigilant, right? Whatever that means. And, all right, so let's jump into the subject of guns as it played a role in this. Specifically the semi-automatic weapons that he converted into automatic weapons, right, with the help of these bump stocks. But I guess I want to, before I get there, I guess, what I wanted to say was, of the 17, I looked this up, of the 17 deadliest shootings, 6 belong to the United States. So in your opinion, why does America experience so many mass shootings as compared to other more developed countries like America? What is your opinion on that?
I'm surprised it's not higher, to tell you the truth, that it was only 6.
Of the 17, right? So
right.
it's 33% of all mass shootings of the 17 greatest.
Well, I think Bob touched on one thing. Laws are different in a lot of other nations where gun ownership isn't as common. I think the number I saw is there are like 100 million guns in the United States. And I don't know if that includes...
I think it's more like 300 million.
Okay.
Close to 270 or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, there are a lot of guns out
Yeah.
there. I guess I don't buy that, just having a lot of guns means that we're going to have a lot of gun violence. It doesn't, and I mean, I think statistics show that gun violence is down in recent years and violent crime is down. But I don't know, guns are a part of our heritage in the United States from the very beginning. Guns were a tool and a way of self-protection, a way of gathering food. So I'm not sure we can get away from that sort of, it's in our cultural DNA, but I don't think that explains the gun violence.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Lieutenant Fields, Bob?
And I'm going to open that Pandora's box.
Absolutely.
That gun is just the tool that they used. Why do we have more gun violence in the United States? Probably because we have more guns here. I mean, that's a pretty simple thing to figure out. If we didn't have the guns, would it be something else is the other question you have to ask there. So if we go back to times before there were guns in the medieval times, so we were doing the same things with bats, swords, and clubs. So it's just a mechanism in which we do harm against each other. Maybe it's a matter of convenience because it's easy to get. I don't know the answer to that question. But we do have laws in place. Are they good enough? I don't know. I mean, we can sit here and debate that till the cows come home, and everybody is going to have a different opinion on that. We really need to think about, and I know that question is, why did they do it? Sometimes we're never going to get that answer either. That goes away with the person that perpetrated the act when they die. So sometimes we don't get that either.
I would say there are two things that distinguish us from Western society, the rest of Western society. One, healthcare system. We talk about a great healthcare system in this country. We don't have a great healthcare system unless you can afford it. Then it's a great healthcare system. If you don't have access to healthcare, good luck. Second distinction, easy access to guns. You don't walk up to any store in Europe and easily purchase a firearm, but you certainly can in the United States. You can go to a gun show and essentially avoid background checks,
Right.
as I understand it. We've had two warring factions on this issue, and we just haven't been willing to say enough slogans, enough politics. Let's find meaningful ground. 80% of the country is in support of toughening up background checks.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone has heard guns don't kill people, people do, right? I've been in multiple conversations in the last couple weeks, and that's been used multiple times. In pretty much any conversation, that's going to come up, right? It's a popular phrase. And the implication with that phrase is that we should not focus on the tool, in this case being the gun being used to kill people. But however, in the case of the Las Vegas massacre, personally I find it hard to imagine that this man would be able to kill or injure as many people with a handgun, a knife, etc. So I guess my question is it reasonable to make it more difficult to acquire a high-powered weapon that he used? So I'm talking specifically about semi-automatic weapons, even the bump stocks that could convert him into a fully automatic. We'll talk a little bit more about fully automatic weapons, but what is your thought there? I mean, I think most people, when you think about it, here he was perched 400 yards away, 32 stories up. How he could have accomplished that without the aid of these high-powered weapons seems unimaginable. And so what is your thought there?
Well, assault weapons, number one, from a law enforcement standpoint, they are a threat every day to our law enforcement personnel. When the other side, when the bad guys are equipped with assault weapons, and assault weapons are easy to acquire in this country. There's some technicalities. I can't just go out and buy a machine gun, but I can certainly go out and buy an assault weapon.
Right. Thoughts, Lieutenant Fields?
Well, first of all, you got to make the right definition on what an assault weapon is, what a high-powered rifle is.
Yeah.
So I'm a hunter in addition to being a law enforcement officer. So if I own a 30-06 rifle that I hunt with, would you consider that a high-powered rifle? And Iowa just allowed, the DNR just allowed rifle hunting in Iowa this year for deer. So some of it comes into definition.
Right.
Now, an assault weapon to me is something that has a large magazine capacity, select fire, which means semi-automatic, not fully auto. And so how do we define that? And do we need to make more restrictions on how we obtain those weapons? Absolutely, it would make it safer for me when I go out on the street every day if I didn't have to worry about that. But that's not the case, And like you said, we need to take the politics and put them aside, and we need to come up with some clear definitions on what we consider an assault weapon, what is a high-powered rifle actually an assault weapon. Mm-hmm. Well, what's the rate of fire? How many rounds can I put down range? How fast can I make the weapon cycle? Those are all things that need to be looked at. in the perspective and how we control the weapons that we have on the market for sale.
Yeah, and I think we're talking specifically about these semi-automatic weapons, that the AR-15s, the AK-15, you know, the ones that were used by this guy. And I think that's what we ultimately have to do, right? You have to draw the line and say, you know, these weapons are banned. I mean, so for instance, in 1934, there was a National Firearms Act that essentially, after a machine gun was used in a crime, was essentially made them more difficult, very expensive to attain, and the sales plummeted, and virtually, you know, they were non-existent. And then in 1986, the Firearms Owners Protection Act made it even pretty much nearly impossible to attain a fully automatic machine gun, if you will. Roughly, there's 120,000 of them in civilian circulation. What I found in my research is that only 2 homicides since 1936 have been committed using a fully automatic weapon. So that basically, I think, is support that, yes, good common sense gun legislation, in this case, a fully automatic weapon that seems not to have a justifiable societal benefit, right? Like, people probably don't need a fully automatic weapon, right? And so I think it was a reasonable legislation. So I guess the question is, are we getting to that point with I think we are with these bump stocks. There seems to be some bipartisan legislation that's going to be passed. But are we creeping to that point with our semi-automatic weapons that are consistently used in these incidences of mass casualty?
Surveys have shown there's widespread support for some of these measures, limiting access to what people call assault weapons, background checks, limiting the number of bullets in magazines, and those sorts of things. A lot of those things seem to be sort of working around the margins, though. I mean, I'm not sure that the universal background check, would have stopped Stephen Paddock. And it seems like most of those things really are kind of on the edges.
Yeah. So let me just ask it straight up. Should we ban semi-automatic weapons like the ones that was used and have been used in a lot of these mass shootings? Is there a justifiable societal benefit? I know people use them for sport, and we use them for, people hunt from helicopters using them in some places. But are we there? I mean, is that becoming a reasonable thing to talk about, or are we still? Are they becoming the machine guns of 1936?
I'll say this. I've been in law enforcement for 23 years. My dad was a police officer in Chicago for 17 years. So I've been in a law enforcement family for a good majority of my life. Criminals are ingenuitive. People that want to do bad things to people, whether it's easily obtained or not, are going to find a way to do it. We can go ahead and say we're going to ban semi-automatic rifles or semi-automatic pistols. With the technology that exists today, the information on the internet, and the ease at which people can mill things on their own, I think you'll just start seeing people make their own weapons. Yeah. I don't know that a ban is going to fix the problems we're seeing right now. Would it slow it down? I don't know, but I don't know an outright ban of semi-automatic weapons is going to fix our problem. The problem's bigger than just one little thing.
So are we at the point of no return to where, I'm
not saying that. Yeah, I'm saying we need to look at the big picture.
Yeah. And you asked the question whether we're at a point where that seems reasonable to ban these semi-automatic weapons or certain weapons. It may seem reasonable, but I'm not sure that enters into the discussion, because the political groups have drawn lines, and there are some people who say that any restriction is a restriction on a constitutional right. You're taking away a constitutional right. Somebody proposed the other day that the only way to really solve this is to amend or repeal the Second Amendment. Well, that's not going to happen. There's not going to be any significant amendment to the Second Amendment.
Well, we have a pretty broad, presently, thanks to one vote on the Supreme Court, there's a broad interpretation of the Second Amendment. Very limited what you can do to regulate firearms under this current Supreme Court. I think it invites, though, us to begin a conversation about amending the Constitution to deal with the fact that we're no longer a society dependent upon a musket and a state militia to guard against the British Empire. We've gone beyond that. Let's talk about a framework where we want to live in a society that's free, but at the same time balancing security against freedom and liberty in this country.
Absolutely. And you know, full disclosure, myself, I own guns. You know, I enjoy hunting, and so I recognize that for some people, even the discussion of gun regulation, you know, banning certain types of guns, evokes strong emotion. Like, you are going to confiscate all of our weapons, right? Those are going to be gone. And you know, and I don't think it has to be that way, or does it have to be that way, right? I think it can be a discussion about not banning. So for instance, I just Googled, does gun control work, right? And second thing that came up, right, was a columnist on townhall.com, and he said this: every time some terrorist, wacko, or radical kills people, liberals always want to take guns away from the people who didn't do it. Their unconstitutional goal is complete gun confiscation, something which would likely lead to mass violence against the people carrying it, out along with the prominent people and government officials advocating it. So again, there seems to be that, right? There seems to be this a bit of, I don't know what you want to call it. I don't know if I would go as far as say paranoia, but maybe paranoia that, yeah, any talk of this is ultimately going to lead to complete gun confiscation. Does it have to be that way? I mean, is it that way? Is that a reasonable thing, I guess is what I'm asking. Is it reasonable to think that if we ban machine guns, and obviously there's still 270 million guns in this country, right? So it's not like all of our guns have been confiscated. If we were to put tighter restrictions on some of these semi-automatic weapons, does that have to mean that all of our other guns are going to be confiscated?
Well, isn't that sort of the problem? Is that even if we adopt gun control, what we might call reasonable, there's still 270 million guns out there, and people will have access to them.
What about a gun buyback program? Is that, I know that's worked in other countries. Would that work here in the United States?
But there's a lot of people that don't want to sell their guns back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you enjoy hunting. Why would you sell your guns back? So I mean, there's a lot of people. You know, I mean, this person touches on something that most of the people who own those 270 million guns aren't causing a problem. They're law-abiding citizens who enjoy hunting, target shooting, or carry a weapon because it makes them feel like they're safer, even if they never use it. But as long as there are 270 million guns out there, there's access.
Right. And again, and we don't have a lot of time here, but I think, you know, in this case, it is easy to conflate, you know, having a gun ban versus banning a certain gun type, right? And I think that's where, you know, the conversation kind of quickly escapes, and kind of it's hard to kind of keep it focused, right? And it's I mean, there's no easy solutions, and certainly we haven't barely touched on it, but I think to kind of wrap things up here, if you were the president of the United States tomorrow, if you were Donald Trump, President Fields, President Rush, and President Lynch, what would you do how would you address the nation as far as how to prevent, not so much why this stuff happened, but how to prevent it from happening again? Each of you have 20 seconds. Go.
Well, I think there are some sort of common sense measures we could take. Background checks, keeping the guns out of the hands of people with histories of violence, mental health issues, those sorts of things that there's probably some broad support for that. Beyond that, I don't think there's broad support for anything. Certainly confiscation, there's no public support or political support for that, really.
I would say out of the millions of people that are gun owners, the vast majority of guns in this country are owned by a much smaller segment. As I understand the data, something like 40 or 50% of weapons are owned by a handful of, a small percentage. You got to give credit, though, to the gun rights advocates who've stood up and been very effective politically. So folks that want to argue in favor of regulation need to mirror that type of advocacy.
Thank you very much. And Lieutenant Fields, we've unfortunately run out of time. I thank you again for joining us this morning. I hope you'll join us next week.